Hi, I'm Patsy Thompson. We talked about using a spray basting wall to prepare your quilts for free motion quilting in an earlier tutorial. I got so many questions about spray basting, and truthfully, moving to basting my quilts on a wall made my quilting life so much easier that I decided I really needed to answer these questions with a video. If I can convince just a fraction of you to try this out, I'll be very happy because it's so fast and so easy to do, and it makes it so much easier to quilt since you don't have to stop to remove pins or thread basting. Let's take a look at a quilt that I'm basting now to get some of those questions answered. Here's a shot of what my basting wall looked like early this morning. You can see that it's composed of ceiling tiles that are attached to the wall, and the edges of the ceiling tiles have old newspapers pinned to them. If I'm working on basting a smaller quilt, I just change the way I've pinned those newspapers to accommodate a much smaller quilt. Here, you see the backing fabric pinned up against the wall with the good side facing the wall. Do you notice all the newspapers that surround this fabric? Remember, I pin those in place before I start basting, and those newspapers keep my wall clean because any excess spray is caught by them. If you're worried about the floor underneath, just throw an old sheet on the ground and wash it afterwards. Remember, 505 basting spray is water soluble, so it washes out easily. So this should answer all the questions about how to handle the off spray. People wondered how I spray baste a larger quilt, and the truth is I do it in exactly the same way, except I'll drag my husband into it if it's a really giant quilt. On a quilt of this size, that batting can be kind of heavy, and it will want to pull itself off the wall as you're pinning it up unless you stabilize it somehow. This is easily overcome by throwing in one or more pins at the upper edge of the quilt as you work, as this avoids any tugging or pulling action on the batting that's already been basted in place. Once my batting layer has been securely basted to the backing fabric, I spray the batting layer with 505 basting spray. Now, many people wrote me questioning whether or not it would work to spray the batting itself, and the answer is yes, in capital letters, yes, I do it all the time and it works. When I get to adding the last layer, or the quilt top itself, I'll have my husband hold on to the part that I'm not actively smoothing onto the wall, and this really helps the process go smoothly. If he's not around, I usually throw a couple of pins into that top section to stabilize what I've already smoothed onto the sandwich, and that way the weight of the quilt that hasn't been basted yet can't pull it off the wall. Now, someone asked how I baste a giant quilt that exceeds the size of my wall, and that is a really good question. I can handle up to 125 inches widthwise on my wall, but I'm limited to only 96 inches height because of my ceiling. Bummer. But I've found a way to work around it. Here's a very large quilt that I spray basted on my wall a while back. If you look at the bottom, you'll see a bunch of non-basted quilt puddled on the floor. So what I did was to spray baste about 90% of it on the wall, and when I removed it from the wall, I laid it out on my cutting table and just spray basted the rest on that flat surface. It really was no big deal. So the bottom line is the technique is exactly the same for giant size quilts all the way down to small quilts and even teeny tiny quilt sandwiches that you want to baste together for doing really small projects like making tote bags or something like that. You pin some newspapers around the area that you'll be spray basting to catch the overspray, then pin and baste each layer together. The only part of this that necessitates an extra step is when your quilt is larger than the wall surface available, and that's when you baste the remaining area on a table nearby. Someone asked about how long this spray basting would last, and it all depends upon which spray basting product you're using. This quilt you see me unbasting was spray basted 4 years ago, and look how easily I can take it apart and baste it right back together with my hands. My experience is that with 505 basting spray, the basting will hold nicely for at least 5 years. I haven't had any quilts take me longer than that to complete so far, so it will last possibly even many years longer than that. Know that for many sprays, like Sulky's spray basting product, they are very clear on the can that they are temporary. Some last only a day or so know what you are buying before you make that purchase. There were a couple of questions about what I do about the exposed batting that had accidentally been sprayed, and this is what I do about that. While the quilt is still on the wall, I do a very rough job of removing the bulk of the excess batting. This way, I have some large pieces left over that I can use for other small projects like tote bags, and that heavy batting is not as likely to dislodge my basting once I go to move the quilt off the wall. Once that's done, I take the quilt to my cutting table and slice off the bulk of excess backing fabric and batting that's left. I only leave about 1 to 1.5 inches of excess batting and backing around the edge of my quilt. Remember, this means less bulk under your machine bed as you're working, and that's a good thing because that'll make the whole process easier for you to quilt. Sometimes there will be small traces of spray basting on the small pieces of batting that are exposed. If this gets in my way as I'm quilting, I simply fold over the backing to the front of the quilt, and this covers it up as I work. Surprisingly, this does not create any stickiness on the front side of the quilt, so there's no need to worry that the quilt will be all sticky once you're done. Now, I use this spray basting wall method to base quilts with all different kinds of batting. Cotton battings, cotton poly blend battings, silk, wool, bamboo. The quilt you just saw me baste together earlier was actually using a silk batting overall, but those giant Queen Anne's lace flowers also had a trapunto layer of wool batting. So know that some battings will require more spray base than others, and the one that really stands out to me is wool, but to date I've been able to spray baste every kind of batting I've ever tried using the spray basting wall system. A lot of people worry that the stickiness that's now inside the quilt may somehow migrate outside the quilt, and it just doesn't happen. As you work on quilting a quilt that's been spray basted, sometimes you'll notice a small blob of stickiness form on the sewing machine needle. When I had first begun spray basting, that little blob was a huge concern of mine, so I was constantly stopping to remove that blob with my fingers. I've learned over time that this is totally unnecessary. That little blob does not interfere with stitch quality in any way, and it does not transfer any stickiness to the outside of the quilt. So now my motto is, let it be. And rest assured that the 505 basting spray does not gunk up the insides of your machine. I use a ton of this stuff and spend many hours quilting, and my machines are all just fine. Now that's it. I won't be able to answer future questions in future videos, but I thought it was really important to do it here because spray basting can really have such a huge positive impact on your quilting life. Now you go and you give it a try, and you'll be a new convert.